Legend of War here, and today we're doing a tier list using Tier Maker. This time going back to Warhammer 2, but doing a very tricky one to explain. This one's going to be a bit of a challenge for me. What we're doing here is explaining how the 15 different races of Total War Warhammer 2 are affected by campaign difficulty. Because a lot of the time, campaign difficulty just provides like a blanket benefit to the AI and a blanket penalty to the player. And some of those benefits and penalties affect races very differently. Some of these races take on those penalties and just brush them aside, just not a big deal for them at all. Other races are just absolutely crippled by them because it doesn't take a lot of things into consideration. These sort of like -8 public order for all factions penalty sort of thing. It can be a very uneven curve between which factions are super strong on legendary difficulty and which ones are just absolutely terrible. So that's what we'll do in this video. Now before we jump into that, I do need to let you guys know that this video here is sponsored by Instant Gaming. Now, there's a bit of a lull between now and Immortal Empires for Warhammer 3, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are waiting for that, myself included. So, I've been playing a lot of other games lately, including a little bit of Medieval 2, which we did on some streams. So, if you've got a bit of a Total War fix that Total War Warhammer isn't filling for you at the moment, which I totally understand, check out Instant Gaming. You can find some really good prices here. All you need to do is just make sure that you're activating in the correct area, and then just make sure they've actually got stock. But once again, big thanks to Instant Gaming for sponsoring this video. Okay, so let's start with this. So there are some factions that I believe that are actually stronger. I should really clarify this one. Like I said, it's going to be a difficult one to explain. It doesn't mean that this faction is easier on legendary difficulty than it is on normal difficulty. Think of it this way. In the hands of an ambitious player, comparing it to normal difficulty and legendary difficulty, a race that falls into this category can get better results of their campaign, like more impressive amount of conquest, on higher difficulties, as in conquer more territory faster, than they can on normal difficulty due to various factors. And then if you're down here, that just means that the difficulty rating has made the campaign especially difficult, due to crippling your own campaign mechanics. Alright, let's get started. So, we'll start with the High Elves. Now, I've said before that the High Elves are the strongest race in the game, which you could argue that point, but there's some other contenders there for the strongest race in the game, and I'll talk about them when the time comes. Now, you might think that I would put the High Elves under stronger on higher difficulty, but there's really nothing about legendary difficulty that actually makes the High Elves stronger. There's definitely areas that makes them weaker. High Elves are just naturally a very powerful race, as long as you're playing them well. Obviously, you can play any race badly, and not utilize their full strength. But everything on legendary difficulty hurts the High Elves, so they're more powerful on lower difficulties than they are on higher. It's just that even on higher difficulties, they're still super powerful. So I'll explain exactly why that is. So there's a couple of things that on higher difficulty just affects every single race. One of them is public order. So on legendary difficulty specifically, you will suffer a -8 public order penalty to all of your provinces. Now for the High Elves, that only really affects you in the early stages of the campaign, again, if you're playing correctly. So there are loads of heroes' skills that you can get throughout your campaign that will give you global bonuses to public order. By the time you reach around turn 100, if you have played well, you should have gotten enough of those public order bonuses to essentially have completely brushed aside all public order penalties, and that being an issue just is gone. Now, the High Elves are suffering from the supply line penalty as well. So that is on legendary difficulty and on very hard. You suffer from 15% extra upkeep costs for every new army that you create. Now, the High Elves are one of the richest races in the game, but they're not one of the richest at the very start of the campaign, so you will struggle with fewer armies at the very beginning, and that's armies that you could have been using to gain more territory or swat aside more enemies. So in the early stages of the campaign, when you're not rolling around in money, the High Elves are suffering from the supply line penalty. However, once they do reach around 50, 100k income per turn, whether you're suffering from 5 to 10 supply lines doesn't really matter that much, because you're just rolling around in so much cash, you can afford to suffer the extra upkeep cost penalty. So the difficulty rating with the High Elves largely comes in at the beginning of the campaign, and then is brushed aside later on. Then, of course, there are more enemies that you have to fight, but the High Elves are a fairly diplomatic race. You can sort of swat aside the anti-player bias fairly easily, with the exception of maybe the Dark Elves. You're going to have to deal with them at some point. Okay, speaking of the Dark Elves, let's talk about them. I would classify them as also being slightly affected by difficulty. So, once again, they suffer from the public order problem, which they would suffer from more than the High Elves because they can't just infinitely keep increasing their public order through hero skills. There is a limit to how much global bonuses of public order that the Dark Elves can get, and at that highest limit, it does make some provinces still difficult to maintain public order if you're also going to make it high income by putting in slaves. They are definitely heavily affected by supply line penalties, which also affects the Black Arcs. While Black Arcs don't increase your supply lines, they are affected by them. So having like 20 Black Arcs, but one army, is a good way to keep your Black Arc cost down, like what I do with Locke here, right? But as you start recruiting more land armies, going more inland, all of your Black Arcs are going to become increasingly more expensive, vastly more so than you would on normal difficulty. Now, something that a lot of people don't seem to understand about how the upkeep cost actually works, all bonuses and penalties are subtractive or additive, right? So they add on to each other. So using an example of that, let's just say you have a Black Arc that has 50% reduced upkeep cost, right? On normal difficulty, in order to have supply lines negate that 50% supply line penalty, 50% upkeep cost penalty, you need 25 supply lines. So 25 additional armies will cancel out the Black Arc 50% upkeep cost reduction. But on legendary difficulty, you only need like 4 to have completely gone over it, because 4 supply lines, that's 60% upkeep cost. There's a huge difference between like normal difficulty and the legendary difficulty in terms of the upkeep cost differences for the Dark Elves. However, more enemies for the Dark Elves is not necessarily a bad thing, because they need to kill and capture loads and loads of enemies in order to capture enough slaves. The more enemies that you fight, or the bigger the armies that you go up against, the more slaves you'll get. So you'll actually generate a higher income for the Dark Elves on higher difficulties. So they are in some way benefiting from the enemy getting loads of cheats. But it's not to the point where they're actually stronger on higher difficulties. You're definitely going to make the Dark Elves stronger if you play on like easy. Okay, next up, Bretonnia. Now, Bretonnia is the faction that I would classify as not really affected by difficulty at all. Now, once again, I'm not trying to say here that if you play on normal difficulty Bretonnia, it's exactly the same as legendary. Not whatsoever. What I'm trying to say here is that the difficulty penalties just don't really hit the Bretonnians hard at all. They brush all of it aside. So public order, let's talk about that one first. It just doesn't really hurt them because they naturally have a very high public order. They don't even really need a lot of global bonuses in public order. They can just maintain their public order quite easily. They've got some good edicts, they've got some good buildings. Their main buildings in a province just naturally increase public order as they get developed. So having the -8 public order penalty just isn't that big of a problem for Bretonnia. Now, they also don't suffer from supply lines at all. So having 20, 30 armies just isn't a problem for their overall upkeep. The only thing here is that on legendary difficulty compared to very hard, at the very start of a campaign, you will immediately suffer a 10% upkeep cost penalty. However, Bretonnia does brush it aside because, like the High Elves, they're a very rich race. If you know how to manipulate their economy and build loads of farms, they can easily pay for whatever you want. And then there's massive cheeses on top of that, and exploits that you can do to make their army essentially free, but I'm not taking that into consideration here. So Bretonnia, not really heavily affected by difficulty at all. Now, let's talk about a race that is pretty badly damaged by difficulty. I wouldn't say that they're crippled by the difficulty rating, but the Wood Elves, I would say, are pretty badly damaged by it. Now, the Wood Elves are a bit of a weird one because they are super strong on the battlefield. The Wood Elves have a very, very strong roster. However, we're mainly talking about campaign difficulty. Now, you can be amazing on the battlefield, right? And just win every single battle. but still really struggle on the campaign map because of various campaign restrictions. Now, the way that the Wood Elves sort of maintain their settlements and the way their campaign goes is that they usually end up with fragmented territory as you are incentivized to go and capture distant tree settlements and restore them. You're going to have a fragmented empire. Now, on higher difficulties, that also means that the enemies around you are more likely to declare war on you, and it's difficult for the Wood Elves to justify raising an army in every single one of these fragments of their empire because of supply line penalties. Now, the Wood Elves are a lower economy race. They can make a lot of money through loot, but they don't make a lot of money through taxes, and that's where the High Elves really shine there. Now, because they suffer from 15% supply line penalties, every new army that you create is going to really hurt the High Elves, the Wood Elves. As you go later and later on into the campaign, you'll find that it'll be more and more difficult to justify raising new armies, unlike with the High Elves, where, you know, later on in the campaign, you just raise new armies like it's nothing. But the Wood Elves, it gets more and more difficult to justify, because once you've captured all of your tree settlements, you just can't really make that much more money, with the exception of actually plundering settlements, and that's not a great way to build up a really strong economy. So the Wood Elves are severely damaged by difficulty. Also, public order is a little bit on the low side for them. Their tree settlements are oftentimes teetering on the edge of a revolt without some degree of public order building or an edict. Wait, then I get edicts, or some sort of hero in order to just make sure it just doesn't revolt. And because they don't build walls, it can be a bit of a difficulty for them. So they're definitely damaged quite significantly by difficulty. So, now let's talk about a race that's actually stronger on higher difficulties. Skaven. So, this is a bit of a weird one. So, I'm not trying to say once again that Skaven on legendary difficulty is easier to play than on normal difficulty. What I'm trying to say is this, that a competent player of Skaven can get a better result of their campaign, conquer more territory faster on a higher difficulty than on a lower difficulty. How does that work exactly? Well, Skaven revolts are actually a good thing, because you use that to farm food and levels up. That's a big thing with Skaven. You want to be fighting lots and lots of enemies every single turn to generate food. You want to use that food to build up your cities quickly, which on lower difficulties you're just not going to be able to do, because revolts will come in less often, and revolts are great ways to generate loads of food. The enemy will throw fewer armies at you, and honestly, there is just about no enemy in the game that Skaven just can't absolutely demolish. There are a few difficult ones that they struggle with, but pretty much anybody they go up against, especially in the early campaign, can be absolutely demolished by Skaven. The fact that they can hit tier 5 pretty much before anyone else, just because of their campaign mechanic, food, is especially powerful. They are mostly hurt, though, by supply line penalties, because they're a low economy faction in the early stages of the campaign and a high economy faction in the later stages of the campaign. But generally speaking, the more enemies that are thrown at the High Elves, the stronger their campaigns actually become. I remember the This is Total War Icket Claw campaign that I did. That was actually one of the most fast expanding Skaven campaigns I've ever done, just because the enemy just kept throwing more and more food at me. I actually struggled to expand fast enough to spend all of that food, because I was just generating so much of it. So Skaven are super bloody strong on higher difficulties, just because the game, they thrive under difficulty. Okay, so now let's talk about the Vampire Coast. I would say these guys here are just slightly affected by difficulty. Public order is not that much of a concern for them. They're mainly suffering from supply line penalties, because they're not a super rich faction in terms of taxes. If you can set up a lot of pirate coves, you can make a lot of money eventually, but I think that it takes a while to sort of set that up, and they can do that sort of a lot slower than other races can get going. But they've got a lot of things to sort of compensate them for. They got a lot of the technology lords that you can get, the 4 infamy lords. Those particular armies can keep your upkeep costs significantly down. However, the Vampire Coast is definitely a lot easier on lower difficulties than it is on higher difficulties. They don't necessarily thrive under absolute mayhem like the Skaven do. So they're just slightly affected by difficulty. Now, Warriors of Chaos. Now, these guys here, the difficulty penalties actually don't really affect them at all. that really gives you an idea of how crap this is as a race, right? So I'm not trying to sit here and say that this is an easy race to play, or that it's easier on normal difficulty, easier on legendary difficulty than it is on normal difficulty. I'm saying difficulty rating doesn't affect this faction much at all, because they don't suffer from supply lines, and they don't have public order. The only way that these guys suffer on higher difficulties is that the enemies that they go up against are larger, but that's how you get loot money. That's how you make money as the Warriors of Chaos, so you can benefit from it. But at the same time, it's mainly in the early stages of the campaign this will happen. The Warriors of Chaos grow so slowly that sometimes you can get your campaign derailed at the very beginning. Whereas on normal difficulty, the AI takes longer to build up, giving you more time to get to, equal them essentially. But once you get to sort of tier 5 as the Warriors of Chaos, whether you're playing on legendary difficulty or normal difficulty, they're just not really affected by the difficulty rating. All the things that normally affect difficulty rating, it just doesn't hit them at all. Doesn't mean their campaign is easy, doesn't mean they're a strong race, doesn't mean they're a fun race. It's just the difficulty rating just doesn't hit them that hard. Now, Beastmen. Beastmen is a race that is stronger on higher difficulties. Now, this is not something I would have said before the Beastmen update. Now, you can also argue that the Beastmen are possibly the strongest race in the game currently, because using any of the Beastmen factions, it's actually possible to conquer the entire world faster than the High Elves. However, the High Elves are definitely, High Elves or Dark Elves, are definitely richer than the Beastmen. However, the Beastmen don't need money since they barely pay for anything. But then being able to generate loads of armies really quickly, the more enemies you fight, the more dread you'll get, the more loot you'll get. So they actually thrive on mayhem, similar to the Skaven. So the higher you pump up that difficulty, the more enemies will come at you, the higher level up you'll get, the more you ambush the enemies, the more dread tokens you'll get. It actually benefits being on higher difficulties than it does on lower difficulties. Like if you're playing on lower difficulty, it'll take you longer to get those dread tokens and actually finish your campaign than if you're playing on higher difficulties, just because the sheer number of enemies that you're fighting per turn. They thrive in mayhem. So, next up is the vampire counts. I'm going to say these guys here are slightly affected by difficulty. So this is a race that also kind of thrives on mayhem in many ways, merely due to no other choice. Everybody just hates vampires, and they're a very isolated faction, whichever one you play. So you have to be able to deal with multiple enemies. They have naturally very high public order if you get the vampiric corruption up, which is very easy to do. There's loads of things that you can do to get your vampiric corruption up. In terms of the supply lines, it can very badly hurt them. Not enough for me to say that they are damaged like significantly by the difficulty, because the more enemies you fight can actually be very beneficial for the vampires, because they benefit from having high level characters, and you're not going to get high level characters without fighting a lot of enemies. And so the more enemies that get sent at you, the better. Also, that means that there will be more large corpse tokens around the places, allowing you, or corpse markers, allowing you to raise the dead a lot easier. So there's a lot of things in the difficulty rating that you'll actually benefit from over if you're playing on lower difficulties. So they're definitely affected by the difficulty rating, but there's things that they can do that compensate them for that. Oftentimes I can get some very ambitious plays with vampire counts. Currently doing a Von Carstein campaign, absolutely loving it, by the way. Hope you guys will watch it tomorrow. But yeah, vampire counts, I don't think they're that heavily affected by difficulty. Then we've got the dwarfs. I'm going to say the dwarfs are damaged by difficulty. They don't thrive in mayhem. They don't thrive by fighting enemy after enemy every single turn. They do, at least in the early stages of the campaign, suffer from public order problems. There are things that they can do later on in the campaign to brush that aside, but I think the thing that affects them most by the difficulty is actually the sheer number of enemies that will throw at them. Because the dwarves have a naturally fairly slow replenishment rate, and that they will probably take a lot of damage in every single fight that they encounter, the dwarfs on higher difficulty just have such a big hill to climb, at least in the early stages of the campaign. Now, again, this isn't here to say that the dwarfs are weaker or stronger than these two races, than the Wood Elves, right? I would actually classify that the dwarfs are stronger than the Wood Elves. It's just that I would say that the difficulty rating hurts the dwarves just as much as it hurts the wood elves, because, like, thinking of, like, Caracas campaign, right? The greenskins throwing too much at you way too early, that's something that the Skaven could handle quite easily, something the Beastmen would laugh at, something that the vampire accounts would revel in, something that the high elves could easily handle, something that the dwarves struggle with. Unless you're a really high level player, they struggle against mass amounts of enemy. They're fairly strong in diplomacy. They're part of the Order Tide. They don't have to fight everyone, but oftentimes their locations, they're extremely slow growth. That's another thing. On higher difficulties, settlements will grow slower, and that really hurts the dwarfs. Just getting to that later stage in the campaign, which is what they need to be doing, takes longer on higher difficulties. Whereas all these other races here, I didn't talk much about growth. All these other races grow really quickly. Now, greenskins. Greenskins are a bit of a weird one. I'm going to say that they're slightly affected by difficulty, because they thrive under mayhem. You want to fight as many enemies as possible, because that's how you really make a lot of loot money. You want the enemy to grow quickly, which will happen on higher difficulties, because your own growth in buildings it's just not even worth doing. It's better to capture somebody else's valuable settlement than to build your own piece of crap hovel up. However, they are very badly affected by supply lines, because they're a naturally low economy race. What I mean by low economy race is that through taxes, they don't make much money. Now, you might argue, but loot is money too. Here's the thing to keep in mind in regard to loot versus taxes. Taxes is a way more reliable way of making cash in Warhammer, really in any Total War game. That is because you capture a province, you secure that province, you move on. That province continues to make you money forever, as long as you don't lose it, right? You have an army, you keep fighting with that army, but it can only handle so much every single turn. Now, as its upkeep cost keeps increasing, right, through supply lines, it's not going to increase the amount that you make through loot. It's still going to be making the same amount every single time it beats the crap out of somebody. So your upkeep costs will eventually go higher than the amount that you make from loot. This is the problem that the Wood Elves suffer from. So if you're not making loads of money through taxes, you're not compensating for that. That's the thing about the High Elves, because they're, and the Dark Elves as well, because their taxes have like a compound interest sort of exposure. As their campaign progresses, even if you've got a tier 5 settlement, those provinces should, if you're playing it correctly, continue to increase in income actually faster than the supply lines cause you penalties. That's something that doesn't happen from the greenskins. However, they thrive in mayhem, so they're only slightly affected by difficulty. Alright, so the Empire. The Empire is also slightly affected by difficulty. Obviously, having loads and loads of enemies can be a bit of a problem, but you do get prestige from fighting a lot of enemies, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. Public order isn't that bad for the Empire. They can maintain, as long as there's not too much corruption, and corruption is something they can very easily get rid of if you know what you're doing with archlectors. You can strip a province of all of its corruption very quickly. Supply line penalties do hurt them, but they're a fairly high economy race, so it doesn't really hurt them that much. So if you're a competent player, the difficulty rating on legendary difficulty should not impede your overall campaign progress that much, because a lot of it does actually rely on diplomacy. So yeah, that's where they go for that. Now, we've got the Tomb Kings. Tomb Kings are not really affected by difficulty. They do have public order problems, but they are a naturally high public order race, especially if you're playing etc. So the -8 public order penalty isn't that big of a deal, and also revolts aren't really that bad for the Tomb Kings anyway, because this is a race, unlike the Greenskins and Wood Elves, absolutely rely on loot money. You need to fight as many battles as possible in order to make any money. If you're relying on just taxes alone, it'll take you forever to build up your income. This is a faction that pays no upkeep for any of its units. You need all of your armies to be fighting battles constantly. So the more enemies that are thrown at you, the better in many ways. Because otherwise your provinces are just never going to get developed. At least not until a late campaign. So yeah, this is a faction that actually cannot rely on its taxable income very much at all. In fact, it's actually better with the Tomb Kings to build like military buildings and make yourself better armies, give yourself better like more numbers of higher quality troops rather than just skelly spam everywhere. so that you can take on more enemies, so that you can get loot. You go plunder a settlement and you reinvest that money back into your settlements, get yourself another Tomb Scorpion, that kind of thing. So I wouldn't say that they're stronger on higher difficulties, because there's some areas that they thrive in, and there's some areas that they are hurt by the difficulty rating. But overall, because they don't suffer from supply lines, and because they have a little bit of public order problems, but the more enemies they fight, the better, I'm going to say that they're not really affected by higher difficulties that much at all. Then we go Lizardmen. Okay, so Lizardmen, these ones here, I'm going to say that they are damaged by difficulty, probably to a lesser extent than the Wood Elves and the Dwarves, but I can't really justify putting them under slightly affected by difficulty, because the Lizardmen are sort of a medium economy race that have extremely expensive armies. They've got some of the best armies in the game. Now, what's one thing that'll stop you from recruiting loads of armies? Supply line penalties. That's the thing that's going to hurt the Lizardmen more than anything. Also, the growth rates grow fairly slowly compared to... Not as slow as the Dwarfs, but compared to the High Elves or Skaven, for that matter. I would say that Lizardmen campaigns go a lot smoother when you're playing on lower difficulties. You definitely can handle higher difficulties. You can do it with all the different races. But I'd say higher difficulties can really throw the Lizardmen a lot of curveballs. They don't thrive under fighting loads and loads of enemies, because they actually don't really make a lot of loot money compared to what they need. So slower based campaigns where the enemy is just not throwing enemy after enemy at you actually eases things up for them. And then there's Norska. I left the best to last. Norska is absolutely fucking crippled by the difficulty rating. No race in Warhammer 2 is crippled quite as bad as Norska in the difficulty rating. It fucks them in every way, shape, and form. Everything that the difficulty rating is designed to do just kicks them in the nuts. Now, this is funny because on normal difficulty, Norska is actually one of the strongest races in the game because of the way that their economy works, right? Super weird system where there's enough buildings in Norska that after you've defeated the Chaos Invasion, all of your armies will be free of upkeep until you have like 20 supply lines, right? Which is a lot of armies. So you've got full fucking stacks of mammoths just pummeling everyone down, and you blow up settlements, and it takes ages for the enemies to go and ruin dwell them, right? Public order is not a problem. Normal difficulty, Norska dominates. You play on very hard or legendary difficulty, and everything changes. Okay, you can have a couple of free armies before the upkeep cost gets ridiculously out of control. 15% supply line penalties on arguably the poorest tax rate race in the game. You absolutely have to pay a fortune for your units. Even though you can reduce that a little bit by going into raid stance every turn, you're going to be going into enemy territory. You can't really occupy every region. So the further inland you go to finish off, like the Empire as an example, it gets more and more difficult. The more enemies you fight, like the Dark Elves eventually start seeing you once they're done with Ulthuan. And as these guys fight more and more enemies, the sheer weight of their penalties become absolutely crippling. To conquer the entire map with Norska is one of the most difficult things that you can do on legendary difficulty. Every single other race can conquer the entire map or blow up the entire map well before like a veteran Norskan player can do it without using like loads of cheats or whatever. Norska is like the most difficult late campaign experience you can have on legendary difficulty, because once they have like conquered Norska and taken out the Empire, that's the end of their momentum, right? They just can't fucking do anything else, because that's the end of like their good settlements. Like they just struggle maintaining their garrisons. Their public order is a massive problem. There is some things that they can do to increase it, but every region that you take is going to have Untainted, and you have to sit there for ages on a province that'll make you 50 gold per turn. Absolutely ridiculous. So they are fucking crippled by legendary difficulty, absolutely crippled by it, which is stark contrast to Skaven, which legendary difficulty is almost laughable for them. It's like everything that the game throws at you on legendary difficulty with Skaven, it actually benefits them in some ways. More enemies, good, more public order penalties, good. Just it's all good. It's all good for the Skaven. But anyway, that's what my rating is for how the game affects different races in terms of difficulty. So we've actually got a pretty even spread here. The middle one here, yeah, look, 6, 3, 3, 2, and 1. Right. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you think of this particular tier list, whether you found this useful information, because some of you guys don't play on Legendary difficulty. In fact, most of you guys probably don't play on Legendary difficulty. And when you hear me talking about certain races being weaker than others, and you're playing on normal difficulty, you may be scratching your head being like, I play Norsca and I think Norsca is really strong. But this might give you some insight as to some of it. The strongest races in the game aren't on the top here. The weakest one is in the bottom, then that's the primary reason it's at the weakest spot. Because if it was on normal difficulty, Norsca is actually one of the strongest races in the game because they have just essentially free armies. I think one of the issues that Warhammer 2 really suffers from in terms of difficulty is that it's not fairly distributed the various penalties based on how the factions are designed. The fact that all factions all suffer from 15% upkeep cost penalties per supply line, despite having vastly different systems, is, quite frankly, very fucking stupid. And it's something that will probably get fixed with Warhammer 3, being that Wood Elves will be able to actually handle holding onto their minor settlements, because minor settlements will have minor settlement battles, and a small garrison might be able to defeat them by tower defense. And that 4% supply line penalties instead of 15% will absolutely cause the Norscans to thrive in Warhammer 3. However, that's something that we can come to later down the track. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope you found it useful. Don't forget to check out Instant Gaming. Big thanks to Instant Gaming again. Appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next time, fuckers. Bye.